Okay, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see some returning faces, names and faces here today. Welcome to the IMBIS Ask Me Anything Series 2024. Um, the AMA series is presented by the International Mind, Brain, and Education Society with the aim of building connections among IMBIS trainees and non-trainee practitioners and researchers. And it's also an effort to expand our community and welcome new names and faces into this space. So if this is your first IMBIS event, we're really glad that you're here. I am Chris Simmers. I'm one of the current co-presidents of the trainee board. We have several other trainee board members here today, so I'll ask them to introduce themselves in the chat. And I also want to take the opportunity to remind everyone that, as you can see in my background, we have our conference coming up in Belgium this year, 10th through the 12th of July. And I'll ask one of the board members to also put more information in the chat about that. So what to expect from these sessions? These are fully recorded, so they can be shared on YouTube later. And if you've registered, you should receive an email with a link to the recording once it's available. We do have American Sign Language interpreters here today, and live transcription is enabled. So please take advantage of these services if they're helpful to you. If you do require live transcription today, just pop your name in the chat for us and make sure that we know, and we'll do our best to facilitate that for you. For the structure of today, we'll start with a 15-minute presentation with our speaker, Dr. Radhika Gosavi, on her work, about her work, followed by a 15-minute facilitated discussion, and then we'll move into our open 15-minute AMA session with questions from the audience. So please, as the session goes on, put your questions in the chat at any time. We'll write them down, we'll take note, and then we'll voice your questions in the final 15 minutes. In terms of vocabulary clarification, we know that we can use a lot of specialized vocabulary, and we know that we also have a lot of people who are new to this space. So please, if we use a term and you're not sure what it means, please ask in the chat. We have a whole team here ready to help. You'll hear MBE a lot. That's mind brain education. And us and our speakers are likely to speak to these themes. And please, if you're unsure on any terms, please ask. We have diverse participants here. We want this to be inclusive, so please feel very welcome to voice questions. So to introduce our speaker, Dr. Radhika Gosavi is a director at the Brainwave Learning Center, a research practice partnership between Stanford University and Synapse School. Her journey as an educational neuroscientist has been enriched by a variety of experiences, from academic research and teaching undergraduate and graduate courses to science communication and fostering global educational development. Radhika's work explores the relationship between brain processes involved in learning and educational experiences through daily collaboration with students, school leaders, teachers, and fellow researchers. She's also a presenter at this summer's conference. So Radhika, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Chris, for the wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here today and share a little bit about my journey and my work with all of you. I have been a part of the greater MBE community for a while now, from the beginning of grad school, and I would say in spirit since the beginning of undergrad, so a really, really long time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started. Also, please do let me know if you can't hear me properly. I've been a little under the weather, so my hearing is thrown off. So just let me know. All right, can everyone see the screen okay? Okay, fabulous. So I'm going to go ahead and start chatting. And the title of my talk was actually something that a PhD student in our lab suggested, which is awesome and quite literal. There's a scientist in my school. And in fact, I'm an educational neuroscientist who is full-time at a school. So that's what I'm going to talk about most of the time today. But before that, I want to back up and start with a little bit of my own background. So back when I was in high school, I used to go and visit a lot of my family back in India for summer breaks, and used to really go to the villages of India with my grandmother, who is also an educator, and work with a lot of school children there. And over time, kind of worked with them to do some workshops and really try to impart some of the educational skills and educational approaches that I was learning about in my schooling in the United States, such as project-based learning. And so from there, I went on to pursue undergraduate studies where I learned more about cognitive neuroscience and discovered that my core interests lie in multisensory integration and learning, memory processing, executive functions, and of course, doing neuroimaging. So that's really what my pathway became. I got my bachelor's degrees at UC San Diego. So that's University of California, San Diego. I did a lot of research there in cognitive science and neuroscience and psychology, and got my degrees in those same disciplines. And right when I was on the crux of deciding how to pursue graduate school, because I knew I liked research, I knew that I had an interest in education from back in high school, working with children in India, and that I really loved cognitive neuroscience. And so one of my mentors at the time, V.S. Ramachandran, he suggested, hey, one of my old grad students just started this educational neuroscience lab at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Why don't you talk to him? So that led me to connect with Ed Hubbard, whose lab I ended up joining to get my master's and my PhD. So that's kind of broad strokes my journey. And from there, I did do a year of like a scientific consulting job, and I realized the industry is really not for me. So from there, I pivoted back and discovered my current position at the Brainwave Learning Center. So, the whole kind of context of the research practice partnership work that we do that I'm going to tell you more about today is this. Traditionally, a lot of research about cognitive constructs in education and the brain mechanisms involved in education has traditionally taken place in very much academic environments. Students are asked to come to labs in universities. And in fact, if we're truly interested in learning about the processes underlying education, what we need to do is we need to go to them and see the environments that students are in most of the time, such as schools, and understand their sociocultural context as well, and use that information to shape our research. And this then takes into account multiple stakeholders, right? It's not just the research team anymore. It's the research team, it's the parent, it's the school leader, it's the teacher, it's the student themselves, and so forth. So with this in mind, our work in the domain of educational neuroscience really brings together three groups, broadly speaking: students, teachers, and researchers. And of course, there's constant communication with the larger community as well of parents, guardians, and so forth. So in the Brainwave Learning Center, this is what we do. We are a research practice partnership between Stanford University and Synapse School. So me and my colleague, Elizabeth Tamarian, we are fully trained educational neuroscientists, and we actually spend all our days at the school. If I wasn't under the weather right now, I would be, in fact, in my office at the school where there would be kids outside lined up, going to class. Sometimes there's piano noises in the background that you could have heard. Chris may have heard them in some of our earlier meetings, I'm not sure. But yeah, that's what we do. We're a fully embedded neuroscience program within the school. And let me tell you a little bit about how that came about. So Jim Egan, the head of Synapse School, and Bruce McCandless, who is the PI of our partner lab at Stanford University, were talking, and they were like, hey, yeah, we should try to understand what's happening in the brain and mind when students are in fact going to school and pursuing education. And from there, they hired myself and my colleague Liz to lead this charge, to really figure out how to develop this program at a school and paved the pathway when really nothing like this had been done before, especially in its scope, where we're there full time. We know the kids. We are full-time staff members of the school, as well as researchers at Stanford University. So like I said, our partner lab at Stanford is the Educational Neuroscience Initiative, which is led by Bruce. And overall, the lab's goal is to link school-based educational experiences with advances in the neuroscience of math and reading by looking at things like visual word recognition, audiovisual integration, as well as math, number, or really literacy and numeracy skills. Broadly speaking, we're also now pursuing new projects in other cognitive domains such as attention, memory, and so forth. So with all of this context, the Brainwave Learning Center, we have some really specific goals. One is, of course, to create partnerships between learners, teachers, researchers, and the larger community. And we want to understand how brain activity is transformed through learning, right? In the most authentic schooling context. And then to investigate how those insights from research can be used to enhance educational experiences or to better them. And we actually have a really great way to try to bring them back to the classroom given our infrastructure. And then, of course, finally, and I would say most importantly, is to get students excited about the brain and excited about neuroscience and really inspire a sense of awe and wonder around all the magic that our brain creates. So I'm not going to go through this figure. This is really to demonstrate that we do a lot of work with a lot of different communities, such as students, researchers, parents. And in today's talk, I really just want to highlight 3 arms of our work with teachers, students, and then, of course, how we can work with these communities to facilitate our research through collaboration, through interaction, in very much lots of feedback loops and lots of ways to talk to each other. There are several ways in which we work with teachers. We work with them to pursue professional development around the science of learning that they can take to their classroom. We talk with them for them to understand more about our research methods. We are very much involved in thinking about the teaching practices, broadly speaking, that happen at the school and how those can be aligned with the science of learning. And then, of course, most important to our research is that we partner very closely with the teachers to co-create our research questions such that they are very much authentic to the educational environment. When it comes to students, we do a lot of different things. There's a lot of pictures on here. We are going to classes all the way from transitional kindergarten to 8th grade to talk about neuroscience and psychology and various topics in that domain. We do a 2-week neurobiology unit with 7th and 8th graders. We visit lower school classes to talk about the science of learning, neuroplasticity, and really anything that the teachers want, and there is a need for in the classroom. We have a middle school research assistant program, which is super cool that I'll talk a little bit more about. And then, of course, the students at the school do engage in our ongoing scientific research. So they work with us every day to be a part of that. Our middle school research assistant program is very unique and very interesting. And if I'm being fully transparent, we did not imagine when we first started it, what it has become today. So there are 5 main goals of this program that are kind of conceptualized as these 5 program pillars, is that these 7th and 8th grade students, they learn about the MBE research, they engage in research practices, they're assisting with our ongoing research protocols, and then they're using all of that information to drive their own independent research projects that are very much born from their own interests, both personally and scientifically. And then they're sharing those scientific insights in various ways. So this program is for 7th and 8th grade students at Synapse School. They're able to apply to this program and through written applications and also through small short interviews that we now do, just mostly because of increased popularity. And so in past years, we have had cohorts of about 6 to 8 students on average. And as a part of this, they're not just working with liaisons such as me as part of the Brainwave Learning Center, but rather they're working with a lot of others. They're working with graduate students, undergraduate students, research coordinators who are part of the larger Stanford community. They're working with various folks from the school network. They're working with global researchers, right? While they're disseminating this information, we have lots of visitors who come to learn about our work. And so they're talking to them to share insights. And then, of course, they're also interacting with the school staff, their teachers, everything from like, hey, I'm going to be 10 minutes late to class today because I have to wrap up a study session during lunch, to telling them about their work as well. And so, like I said, they are very much involved in disseminating this work. In the past, they have submitted to all sorts of science fairs, from the county science fair to the state science fair to the national science fairs. They have presented at various events, including like a big research showcase that we have, and presented to lots of visitors. And what we have found in this program is really interesting, that of course, our endeavor started off as like, hey, we're at a school, we should teach some students about science and the scientific method and the science we do. And in fact, we found that this whole process is helping them develop their identity as learners and students at the core. So they are benefiting not from just the added advanced scientific knowledge and learning that they're getting, but they're also gaining a sense of increased responsibility. They're learning about this really core construct of like grit. They're learning the importance of fostering relationships and so much more that's really helping them build their identity as a holistic learner and not just like in the scientific domain. So this has been a really, really interesting adventure to be a part of. And of course, at the end of the day, we are a research program. Our core focus is to conduct research at the school. And so we do research primarily in the domain of cognitive development, learning, and trying to understand the neural mechanisms of topics like literacy, math, attention, multisensory integration. And something that I will mention a little bit more about later is that we actually have a state-of-the-art neuroscience lab in the school. In fact, it used to be a storage closet that has now been converted to a neuroscience lab, and is really a replica of our EEG lab at Stanford. And so broadly speaking, our research questions are talking about how can we improve the learning process? How can working with educators inform scientific questions? How can we merge what's important in the classroom with figuring out what the most high energy scientific questions are? How can our understanding of the neuroscience impact educators? And ultimately, how can our work inform evidence-based educational interventions and support all learners, including those with learning differences? So I'm going to go through just one example of a study briefly, that was led by PhD student Lindsay Hasek in our lab. So this study actually spanned about 3.5 months, and was done with 3 first and second grade classes. And it aimed to measure how teacher-led classroom activities over 2 weeks lead to concrete changes in spelling. And specifically, it aimed to understand how does the way a teacher directs attention to the grain size of a word change the wiring of the brain, right? So over here, we have 2 conditions of interest. We have one, which is a lexical focus. And really you can think of that as like a whole word focus, where teachers are teaching students words like grind, night, serve. And the goal is of that week to teach these with automaticity. The kids should be able to rapidly identify and spell these words in their entirety at the end of this week. The contrast here is this sublexical focus with the idea of flexibility. Over here, the teachers are teaching students the same words, or actually a different set of words in a different way, highlighting the onset or the beginning part of the word, like the GR, and the rhyme unit or the word family, which is the end of the word, like eind. So in week 1, they're learning grind as one unit. And in the second week, they're learning it as gereind, as two separate units. And the question is, how do these approaches change the way the students are learning to spell, and how does that change the underlying brain mechanisms? And then one really important contrast that we had, or information that we aim to gain, was how did these skill transfer? So we had other words similar to this, like mind, flight, verve, that were used as transfer words. And we're in the process of turning this data. Unfortunately, I can't give you a sneak peek today. But the way that this whole study happened is super interesting. So it was fully co-created with teachers and other educators at the school through many ongoing meetings. Then we went to the classes and we did kind of like a pre-test of sorts, or a spelling check-in. Then individual students were brought to our EEG studio to understand how their brainwaves are while doing spelling. Then there was this 2-week in-class learning sprint where the teachers really taught these kids how to spell words using the 2 strategies that I just mentioned. And then we had post brainwave sessions as well, where we were able to understand how children's and students' brainwaves are changing and growing as they have just gone through this 2-week learning sprint. While in the classroom, they did all sorts of interesting activities. We had teachers and other school leaders and myself lead the charge on creating exciting activities, including like, writing the words and like flower to the Engineering and Design Center on campus was able to create like a puzzle game or a Plinko game to try to teach spelling. And then we had in-classroom research sessions where they did paper and pencil tasks, iPad tasks, and the whole goal was that these classroom activities were intertwined with their educational experience. So another study that is just ongoing right now is called Tides in Engagement, takes another co-creational approach, except this time with 7th and 8th grade students. So I'm happy to share more information about this if you're interested. But I do want to wrap up with some takeaways about our work in research practice partnerships. And there's a few, we have really understood and learned the importance of authentic relationships between researchers, educators, students, and the parent community. They really form the context for informing the research questions and the methodologies that we use. We really try to use a inclusive recruitment approach to reduce barriers to participation. And this has led to many interesting conversations with IRB folks. Happy to share more about that as well, because we do research in a really non-traditional environment, right? In a setting that's very different than like the controlled, quiet lab environment at a university. We are mapping the causal behavioral neural changes as a result of classroom experiences. This has been a really, really rich experience. And, it's an ongoing learning experience. Schools are super dynamic. You have to have flexibility in scheduling. Like yesterday, we had a 7th grade girl say, "Hey, I don't want to do my EEG session today, although I knew about it because I straightened my hair. And putting on the EEG net is going to make it frizzy. So like, no." And we're like, okay, so now we'll try to find someone, right? There's noise. Synapse School has a very open floor plan, so there are not really too many ceilings, and there are kids involved, right? So there's all sorts of other dynamic changes. And so we are very much in the midst of learning how to navigate these things. And something that we're going to try to do next is explore wearable technology as one way to situate our research in even more authentic settings, like in the classroom, and try to understand how brainwaves are changing as a part of that. So with that, I want to just quickly highlight, as Chris mentioned, our group has a number of submissions to the IMBIS conference coming up in Belgium over the summer. I have put together a symposium that really highlights the work that we do in the Brainwave Learning Center and other colleagues do in IMBIS, broadly speaking, of partnering with educators and students in mind, brain, and education research. So Ninka is going to be speaking as a part of this, as well as Adi and Alana's group over in Israel, as well as Nicole Landy's group from the East Coast in the US. So it's going to be a lot of cool stuff. And like I said, we have a number of different submissions. Bruce has a symposium as well, along with graduate students. Lindsay Hassick and Maddie, they're going to be talking about their work in deep sea spellers and tides of engagement, and postdoc student in our lab, Fong. So please do come check out our sessions. And with that, I want to say thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions. Also, feel free to email me anytime.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have lots of questions coming in the chat already. Please continue to send those in. So I'll just ask one on our behalf, and then we're going to switch over to the participant questions. But thinking back on everything that you've done with it at this intersection of like education and research, what would you say has been the most impactful change that you've seen arising from the work that you do, either your work specifically or in the MBE field more broadly?
Wow, that's a big question. I think, really it goes back to the importance of understanding the sociocultural context of schools. That has added so much color to our work, right? Everything from how do we communicate, how EEG works? How do we talk to parents and make sure that they feel comfortable and confident when their child is coming to us and we're able to see their brainwaves? How do we communicate to a middle schooler that seeing their brainwaves doesn't actually tell us who they have a crush on? Or, how do we make our research activities and research tasks more fun? How do we negotiate scheduling in the midst of a school day? And, most importantly, how is research contextualized within a school environment changing the landscape of MBE and the types of research questions that we're asking, and really thinking about why we're asking them? So I would say that all taken together.
Wonderful, thank you. And as a former teacher, Sarah and I are both former elementary teachers, so we can fully appreciate the dynamic nature of actual schools. We're going to jump over to attendee questions because we have some great ones. We're going to start with Anne because she got hers in first. How have students contributed to advancing your research beyond providing data as participants? For example, have they given input on study designs? And also, what are they learning from the research you're doing?
Great question, and I think a super important one. So I'll give you one example. Students are, of course, participating, and that is a great contribution. But a lot of the times, like the one specific example I can think of, they are actually driving our next research questions. So we did this study called the Magic Word Study that I didn't really highlight today. But the whole goal of this was to see how 2 weeks of teaching in the classroom can help kids learn new words, difficult vocabulary words, and how that knowledge carries into brainwaves, and how it sticks for time moving forward for the next year or so. So at some point, a year later, after this study concluded, we went into this like third grade classroom and we said, hey, how many of these 20 words that you learned a year ago do you remember, right? And so the kids kind of just did a free recall task, and some kids remembered 5, some kids remembered 20, some kids remembered 0, right? All of that happened. And then right after that, it was dismissal time. So I was walking this third grader out to the parent's car, and he goes, well, it was really hard for me to like pull the words out of my brain because I like haven't really seen them in a year. But I bet you if you showed me the word, I can remember what it means. And I was like, that's interesting. And so we went back, looked at the literature, and actually saw that, yeah, like this is an interesting novel question that maybe free recall isn't quite easy, but what are the semantics that are involved in remembering the word and understanding it at a deeper level. And we actually ended up doing that as a follow-up EEG contrast as well. So that's one specific example of how students are adding to our research.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question is big and broad. I'll warn you ahead of time, but it's a great one. So Alden says he's interested in the research of Dr. Mary Helen Imordino-Yang, specifically her insights into the 3 neural networks that support transcendent thinking. Do you know of any research that suggests specific school designs or experiences that develop these networks and this sort of thinking?
Yeah, great question. And transcendental thinking is so important, because it really tells us the big picture, I would say, how they're thinking, how students are gaining these skills and thinking and applying them to the big picture and their ability to really zoom out. And it is so indicative of like the adolescent development process, broadly speaking. Off the top of my head, I actually don't know any specific school designs that may be helpful to that. But from my own experiences, the middle school research assistant program that we have and their ability to kind of pursue their independent project from their own interests, I have seen some markers of this, that they're not only able to think about how this research question is important for themselves and maybe even the school community, but really why it's important to learn more about this and communicate it to other students to help their processes as a learner, and for them to think about themselves as a learner in the greater context. So as an example, last year, one of our research assistants, he pursued a study on dyslexia and the brain mechanisms that support that. He himself has dyslexia, and through that, he gained a lot of empowerment himself as a learner and learned a lot of skills. And in fact, went on to talk to other students about not only his scientific research, but really to think about why dyslexia has helped him, empowered him to pursue this advanced learning process and so forth. And as a part of this, was really able to reflect in the grand scheme of things, much like the transcendental thinking that Mary Helen talks about.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to go a little bit out of order because you just touched on one of our other questions, which is students with disabilities. So are students with disabilities included in your research samples, and does any of your research specifically target special education instruction?
Yeah, so yes, all students are included in our sample. Those with disabilities that have been diagnosed, some with disabilities that haven't been diagnosed yet, as well as those without disabilities. So we do include everyone in our sample, and we believe that's important, because if we're truly trying to get a picture of how learning takes place, and try to understand how learning is happening across a broad spectrum of learners as there are in natural classrooms, I think it's important to include everyone. And actually, I'm going to pull in Maddie, who I see on this call here. She is the graduate student leading our Tides of Engagement project and is also currently teaching a graduate class at Stanford University in the Graduate School of Education about various disabilities. So Maddie, please chime in.
Sure. I would just add, sorry, I'm in the school right now, so if you hear any background noise, that's what's happening. I would just add that we take what I would say is a really inclusive approach to thinking and looking at disability at Synapse School as a community that we've also tried to translate into our research approach, which is that all students are automatically included. We talk a lot about the differences in strengths that happen from the different ways that our brains wire and fire. We're actually celebrating right now Neurodiversity Week at Synapse. And this is something that's really important to us and to me as well. I'm an inclusive education scholar as well as a disability studies scholar. And so this is sort of a perspective that we weave in and we talk to the kids about. When I was working on the Tides and Engagement project that Radhika discussed earlier, part of my approach was that I co-created our questions about attention and engagement with the middle schoolers to intentionally capture the many ways that we think about attention and engagement. And this was intentionally done in a way that was different from more clinical historical assessments of attention that tend to be very neurotypical, that tend to focus on what does a good student look like, how do they sit, how do they pay attention, how do they orient themselves towards the teacher. And a lot of the goal of this conversation was to make sure that when we're creating our research, when we talk about these topics with the students, that we make sure that we're taking an approach that captures the way that they all engage and they all attend. And I learned a lot from the middle schoolers about their use of fidgets, their flexibility in the classroom, the way that they feel that their teacher supports them in getting up and moving about and using a standing desk versus having to sit the whole time. So yes, this is something that we're kind of constantly thinking about and trying to make inclusive, not only in our research, but also in how we talk about the students, about other research, about themselves and their own brains.
Thanks, Maddie. That was lovely.
Thank you so much. And thank you, attendees, for all the questions. We have about 10 more minutes left and so many great questions. So the next one is a quick one, I think, from Ed. He's curious about the wearables. So what specifically are you considering with those, and what is affordable for wearable technology?
Yeah, right now our first foray with the wearables is really in the realm of attention, specifically auditory attention. And that is for a couple of reasons. One, that is really the expertise that the postdoc in our lab has, who is leading the charge on this project. So, I think the first kind of move forward has to be something that's a domain that's kind of comfortable. And from there, we'll start to explore other processes. So that's our first foray into it. I think in terms of affordable, I'd be curious to hear more about like affordable in what sense. And I guess I could say from the resources perspective, for us right now, we have a couple of helmets. Those are affordable from a resources perspective, which truly may not be the case for many schools out there. So I recognize the privilege that comes with. And in the other sense, what is affordable, we are very much figuring that out right now. And we work with our middle school research assistants to identify like, hey, what could be the stigma around this? Why could this be cool, right? What are the affordances that we have in a classroom environment? Like, if a kid is sitting in there with a wearable helmet, like, is it going to be distracting? So we have gained many insights into the fact, along with the fact that like wearable helmets can look like eggs and therefore they might be distracting. Or yeah, things like that. We're very much figuring it out, but our first foray is in the domain of auditory attention in middle schoolers. Also because the wearable helmets we have right now don't really fit lower school students. So that's another barrier.
Yeah, great point. Thank you for that. The next question is from Tamara. What about the Synapse School made it a good place for this collaborative brain research work?
Yeah, there's two main things I would highlight. First and foremost, the most important is that we have full support from the leadership of the school, and everyone at the school is fully bought in. Like they are supportive of the research, they understand the importance of the research, they understand that we're doing something that's new and novel, and they're along for the ride. They're flexible in all that means, right? So teachers are okay if we're pulling kids out of class for an hour for an EEG session. Parents are okay letting their students stay an hour late for a research session or come in earlier in the morning to start their research session. Everyone is willing to kind of give time for these ongoing meetings to co-create these research studies. So that is the most important reason, I think, that makes Synapse School the right partner for kind of the first iteration of this kind of fully embedded research practice partnership. The other part of it, which is something that I and our team is well aware of, is that Synapse School is incredibly well resourced. And so what that allowed us to do is really do this new thing and give it our best shot. And these resources have allowed us to kind of make that foray, have an EEG lab in the school, right? We have like a collaborative classroom working space. We have an EEG lab. We have, a couple of independent offices. So everything from space to resources, we have those. And that have really allowed us to have a proof of concept, to gain some learnings that as our next step, we're hoping to translate to other schooling environments that may not be as well resourced, but having a partner school that has resources really allowed us to kind of like get our work off the ground.
Thank you so much. We're down to two more questions in about 5 minutes, so I think we can do it. Samira has an excellent question. How would you suggest introducing this type of relationship between universities and school districts, specifically appealing to the district leadership team? I could see reluctance, fearing students are being used as lab rats if the university approaches the relationship.
Yes, important question. I would say do it slowly. Like through ongoing conversation. I think, something that when me or anyone else in our team talks about, I think we should highlight is that the scope of the work that we're doing today is not the scope of the work that we were doing 3 years ago, or even last year. Like it has grown over time. And it has grown because we have built relationships over time, slowly, and have built trust. And so, I think the most important thing to do when you're talking to school districts, particularly public school districts, or really any, school, educator, anyone as a researcher, is have conversations, respect your own expertise and respect their expertise, right? Everyone is an expert in their own domain. And so respect each other's expertise, build trust, listen, sincerely listen to their reservations, and do your best to talk through it. And it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time and take baby steps to start with.
Excellent advice. Thank you for that. And our very last question of the session, it sounds like you mostly focus on cognitive aspects of learning measured through assessments in EEG. Do you also include other aspects of learning like affect, motivation, identity, self-talk, etc.? And do you use other types of data to help to understand differences in students, such as SES, first language, gender, parent education, etc.?
Yeah, great question. So part of the reason that our work focuses on like these specific cognitive domains is because that is the expertise and background of the individuals in our lab. That is slowly changing and growing as, we have the bandwidth and the flexibility to expand those areas, and to have the trust built up to be able to expand those areas. And so, yeah, this year, actually, we're making our first foray into a project that is really looking at academic self-concept and how a learner's identity changes as they learn more about their own learning, and also learn about their brainwaves. And so this is kind of a new domain for us, and we're excited to kind of go into it. But having said that, I think it is also something that we're doing slowly, like we have done with everything else. And yeah, and like I said, the middle school research assistant program, that paper is under review right now in MBE. And one of the things that I did was made my first foray into like the literature around holistic student development and the gain of various types of skills, both that are more traditionally thought of as academic, or other skills as well, such as responsibility and grit and so forth. So I think it's a natural process in our work, right? If you're working with students in a school, that you're gonna have to come across these topics. So we're doing it slowly and steadily.
Wonderful, thank you. And that concludes the end of our AMA session. So thank you so much for joining us today, Radhika. That was wonderful. Thank you to our interpreters and everyone who joined the session today and your wonderful engagement. We will share the links and any recommendations from today's AMA by email with everyone who registered, as well as Radhika's email and contact information. And we just want to remind you one more time about the summer conference in Belgium. Come on over, you'll see lots more from Radhika and her lab. And our next AMA session, we're happy to announce, is Dr. Janet Dubinsky on Thursday, the 25th of April at noon, the same time. She's going to talk about neuroplasticity, reward circuitry, and look at how these concepts intersect with pedagogy and practice in everyone's unique context. So for those that don't know, Dr. Janet Dubinsky is a renowned neuroscientist and professor of neuroscience at the University of Minnesota Medical School. Her research focuses on brain metabolism and physiology. She's globally recognized for her work on the impact of neuroscience education on teaching and is the founder of the BrainU program. This program offers professional development in neuroscience and the biological basis of learning and memory for K-12 teachers. So if that is of interest to you, please register for our April AMA, share it with your friends. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.